And we're also then going to focus on all the areas where we feel we can bring together the different stakeholders to build back better coming out of the pandemic. It's a phrase we've heard a lot, but we hope to give it some more meaning and not just, as Greta Thunberg would say, blah, blah, blah. So we want real input today, some good ideas and some concrete thoughts. With that, I'm going to introduce you to our keynote speaker, who is Benjamin Bratton, who is the Professor of Visual Arts at the University of California. And he's the author of The Revenge of the Real, Politics for a Post-Pandemic World. I find that it's a huge issue and a huge challenge. It's a call to arms, perhaps more than a book title, I think. But we're going to hear the speech you're going to give us today, Benjamin, and then we're going to talk in more detail about it, is Lost in Transformation, Digital Sovereignty and Competence in Times of Crisis. We're doing this online, partly because we're in a time of crisis, but hopefully you will be able to give us some optimistic viewpoints and perhaps a silver lining. So over to you, Benjamin. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the introduction. Thanks very much for conference organizers for the introduction, and asking me to join you today. My remarks are on the topic of governance more generally, the question of computation and governance, how the role of computation in the reimagination of what governance is. And indeed, we'll begin with the pandemic. In that I see the pandemic in many ways as a kind of crisis of global governance. It's a crisis because in the place where a competent planned response might have been, there was instead what we may look back upon as the kind of international anarchy. It was every country for themselves, but it didn't have to be this way. We could have been much better prepared. We could have had a planetary scale biopolitical system in place that was capable of predicting and sensing and tracking and modeling and simulating, and more importantly, acting back upon the pandemic in real time. That is, the virus, not necessarily tracking us. We could have had a system that no matter where you were in the world, you could have received the care that you needed. But instead, we made everybody go back to their country of passport in order to be tested and in order to be cared for. So at least in this regard, having everyone sent back to their country of passport, the pandemic was also a kind of massive experiment in comparative governance. Some things worked, some things didn't work at all. Some things worked for a little while and then stopped working. But it is not just a matter of state policies. It's also a matter of different political cultures. What worked in Taiwan would be culturally unacceptable, perhaps, in Texas or Italy. And also, what failed were not just then forms of governance in the policy sense. What failed were also forms of political culture, incapable of acting in their own interests, even when the backs were literally to the wall. And so in order to conceive of and build, hopefully, another kind of culture of planetary governance, we need a different political culture, a different logic of what politics is, where it sits, and what it does. In short, we need to understand that societies must have the ability to compose themselves. Planless emergence isn't good enough. Societies must be able to sense themselves and model themselves and act back upon themselves. It means recognizing that society is planetary. It has been so long before modernity. So if we're going to make it through this century to see the 22nd century, one that we would actually want to live through, our capacity for self-composition must be the subject of our most intense imagination and reason. So let me go specifically on this question of computation, the role within this. The modes of computation I'm concerned with here are ones of planetary infrastructure, more than computation as a purely social medium, for example. My work is on the significance of planetary scale computation. Its reality, its potential, its effects are obviously quite ambivalent. An earlier book of mine called The Stack was about what planetary scale computation is, and my more recent work is perhaps about what planetary scale computation is for. What today is arguably the dominant mode, the dominant models of planetary scale computation are, as we know, private advertising and consumer commerce platforms that provide search features and mapping and time management as sort of byproducts. Also, the militarization of what the U.S. and China commands both call cyber is another mode. But not only are these not what planetary scale computation is really for, they're also not entirely what it is. By this, I mean the scientific, for example, the scientific and cultural idea of what we call climate change is itself an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. Climate science is based on this planetary scale constellation of satellites and surface and oceanic temperature sensors, ice core readings, billions and billions of data points fed into supercomputers that run models of the climate past and present, and thereby through them also the future. So in that, climate change has necessitated the reckonings of what some call the Anthropocene, including the shifting perspectives on what the emergences of humanity, of capitalism, colonialism, and so far, what these mean. No academic discipline has been exempt from this new reflection. What we might recognize then as Anthropocene theory is also, therefore, another, if indirect, epistemological accomplishment of planetarity and of the planetarity that planetary scale computation has disclosed and made conceivable and critical. This obviously better vocation for planetary scale computation is in no way hypothetical or utopian. It is, in fact, the present. However, for this mode of infrastructure to shift from the descriptive and predictive modeling to a medium of composition is quite another thing. Another mode is another thing. And a more viable planetarity it requires then the conception, composition of a whole new infrastructure, and more importantly, a different purpose. For example, consider carbon removal. Recent IPCC reports suggest that they determine and even presume that many billions of tons of already existing greenhouse gases must be removed from the climate for the proposed wide-scale decarbonization to have any chance of success at 1.5 or 2 or even 3 degrees. What does that entail? It means essentially, to visualize, running the oil companies in reverse for decades. Think of the entire sprawling apparatus that is a global oil company. And now imagine that instead of extracting carbon from the ground and shuttling it elsewhere so that it can be extinguished into the atmosphere, that instead the carbon is extracted back from the atmosphere, shuttled elsewhere, and buried back into the ground. Done by every oil company for the coming decades. This is the scale of what is required. So shall we build this infrastructure completely new, or should we repurpose the ones we already have for this great inversion? Both, probably. Now, here's the point. This infrastructural imperative is not necessarily contradictory to individual behavior changes and moral reckonings, but the latter only has any effect if it can make the former a reality. That is, the intense individuation of climate politics in the vein of green consumer behavior programs or Extinction Rebellion's commitment to performativity as politics is, if taken all on its own, arguably perhaps worse than ineffective. It is a shifting of the focus onto the correction of the individual at the far edge of the network, instead of the replacement of the infrastructure or the reformation of the purpose of the infrastructure of the network itself. The individual is, in other words, the wrong unit of analysis and of action. Now, drawing this back then to the conference's topics more directly, the individual is also the wrong unit of analysis and action for planetary scale computational infrastructure replacement as well. I'll explain. But first recognize that the intense and legitimate focus on, for example, individual rights of individual citizens and individual users to remain private and autonomous from forms of platform surveillance and manipulation is based on a presumed individuation of the interests of planetary scale computation. That is, the user and the citizen are both individuals. Again, it's not that such interests from GDPR to privacy tech are somehow wrong. They're not. But like the emphasis on changing individual behavior and having intense illuminating climate experiences are also not wrong. They can, however, both obscure the bigger issue of composing and constructing another planetary scale computation, another purpose at the infrastructural scale that is existentially necessary.
Che è essenzialmente necessaria.
The issue then, I think, for this is most acute in the critical discourse around surveillance, which sets up the issues at stake as sort of as fundamentally ones of systems versus individual. For example, while I agree with many of Shoshana Zuboff's criticisms of how big platforms manipulate users, my own critique of her critique is that, in essence, it doesn't go far enough. And because of this, the larger discussion about sensing and surveillance has become muddled. In essence, Zuboff's critique sees the essential problem as one in which otherwise free and autonomous individuals have been captured by opaque and coercive contractual relations with platforms, and so much must take back their data and otherwise seek to re-atomize and privatize and re-individuate themselves as users so as to rebalance the force. Perhaps this is so, but the deeper problem, as I say, is the over-individuation of planetary scale computation in the first place. Building this entire megastructure through the intense focus and modeling of individual consumer behavior is the specific problematic outcome of building it to focus and model individual humans in the first place, as opposed to the social and planetary conditions that support their lives, which now in many ways I think must be the project. So let me then switch gears real quick and to talk about specifically Europe's role in this, and a quick discussion of what Europe what it mean for this. I happen to think that Europe's leadership is essential to constructing the modes of infrastructural planetary scale computation that the world needs, but it will also be fundamentally transformed by this role. Much has been written, as we know, about the emergence of the modern nation state through the context of technologies that would form the foundation of the modern industrial projects. You know, political philosophy, political theory sometimes prefers to imagine itself as autonomous from the technological milieu over which it imagines itself sovereign, but this has in a way always been illusory. Today, the European stack, as we might call it, sits inside and next to a North Atlantic stack, a greater Chinese stack, as a kind of simultaneous convergence and divergence of these hemispherical regimes confuses conventional distinctions between local and global, land and sea, public and private, fast and slow. What Europe is not the same thing as what Europe is now, is not what it will be in the year 2200. It's not the same as today. The question at hand then is not ultimately how it is that as conventionally recognized as a conventionally recognized federal Europe can maintain the sovereign integrity of its homeostatic geopolitical morphology by properly filtering, monitoring, managing, suppressing, banning, channeling, regulating, regularizing foreign digital platforms, and perhaps by concocting indigenous versions. It's not that this project is illegitimate, but this is, in fact, in the long run, ultimately not the project. Europe's role is perhaps far bigger. I would suggest that, I don't have enough time, obviously, to sort of go into more detail, but I would suggest that to make the point more fully, that planetary scale computation not only twists older modern forms of political geography, it also produces new territories in its own image, dragging the old along with the new and vice versa. That is, it's not just that Europe will have to govern planetary scale computation, is that along with every other place, planetary scale computation will ultimately transform with the very shape of what a polity is per se. And how it is bound and unbound by particular spatiotemporal parameters beyond the terra firma. So while Europe will attempt and perhaps succeed in shaping planetary scale computation according to its jurisdictional interventions. Planetary scale computation, 2, will remake what Europe is in the first place. The next century, as I see it, will be characterized by a kind of delamination or detethering of the state from the nation, from physical territory, in ways that will invite cosmopolitanism, chauvinism, confusion, innovation all at once. I suppose many of this audience knows this, and I'm probably affirming what we all, in a certain sense, know, but perhaps simply stating it a bit more explicitly. But lest we all agree with each other too much, I'll invite some controversy. But when I say that, as far as a planetary politics is concerned, the commonsensical principle of, for example, indigenous versus foreign data is probably already an anachronism. The shift towards the mode of computation, infrastructural computation that we need will require not the entrenchment of national and regional coalitions into recovered sovereign domains from global influence, but rather, I think, the realization of a planetary scale political programs, parties, platforms, and policies. And we see this to some extent already, from Steve Bannon's tendrils on the one hand to the various Green New Deals on the other. Versions of this are already part of the landscape, sometimes denounced, sometimes celebrated. But oddly, we also see how right-wing populists who are organized a global coalition and funding structure to support multiple nationalist, traditionalist, isolationist programs, whereas left-wing populists organize multiple local coalitions and funding structures to support an internationalist, progressive platforms. I wonder, with sincerity, which strategy is actually more absurd. Let me conclude then, before the discussion, to simply say that in 1921, the literature was full of references to the year 2000. In 2021, there's not so much in the year 2200. I don't think that's just the appeal of round numbers. I think it used to be that in a certain sense, the future was understood as something to be achieved. Today, however, the future is something to be prevented. Or miraculously, the future is to be prevented so that another future, one that is in which planetary civilization that is viable can be realized. The resistance to the future, in more generally, is obviously not an unfamiliar position for the conservative impulses of the Western left after '68 to a certain extent, but certainly after 1980. The date 1980 clearly obviously means something rather different in China, though. But the realization of the viable future that is existentially essential is a project that is compositional, not just critical. And that part is a bit less certain. In terms of digital platforms, what does this apply? It means replacement, not just regulation. The program is to mobilize the tools of the Westphalian state and its intended federalisms to govern digital systems within territorial borders. All this has real importance for good and ill, but it is also, it must be said, a vision of progressives and autocrats alike. It is in and of itself not enough. More broadly, the challenges of planetarity shift the project of governance to its core. Instead of mediation of popular voice, governance rotates towards the administration and allocation of viable ecosystems, inclusive of human societies and their myriad entanglements and semiotics. Luminary humanists of the last century see this taking shape in the haze, but in some ways can't quite make sense of what to do. For that, we need to conceive and construct a different culture of governance. Societies must have the ability to not simply to produce and to consume and to signify mindlessly, but to deliberately compose themselves. Planless emergence may be the background force of evolution, but deliberation and deliberateness have themselves emerged and must be re-embraced as the basis of collective agency. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. That was fascinating as a start off for our discussion this afternoon. I'm going to encourage everyone to use that Q&A function, use the questions box, use the boxes you can see for questions for Benjamin. But let me start first by suggesting a quote by one of my favorite authors. William Gibson says, "The future's already here, it's just not very evenly distributed." Now, you're talking about things on a planetary scale, but could you perhaps reflect on that and the, the truth behind that, or not, as you see it?
Yeah, there are multiple futures, always. The notion of the future itself is something that has a past and a present and a future. There's a history of the idea of the future itself. I think that one of the things that, as I've suggested, that in the way that climate science has produced an understanding of an Anthropocenic predicament, which is in fact, sort of transformed not just what earth sciences is, but ultimately what political philosophy is, and hopefully what political systems are. One of the things that it's also made clear is that our sense of human history that has guided the modern project for some time is actually quite parochial. There's a work by the wonderful historian Dipesh Chakrabarty. Chakrabarty argues that in essence, we need to think about not just history in terms of the history of human social systems, but the history of human social systems, but as also a history of life itself, history of biology and the emergence of life on the planet, and then the history of the history of planetary systems even beneath this as well. In other words, the moment of the present in which we find ourselves is a moment within a deep time. The scope of history that has brought us to this present moment is much deeper than we have previously normally conceived. The implication of this is that so too is the future. We need to be thinking about, as much as possible, an understanding of the future, not only in terms of the relatively local and short time cycles of a single human life or of a few generations, but understand futurity in relationship to the scope of time of the biological and planetary systems in which we are embedded. Our future is entangled with those. Our future is dependent upon those. And the ability to conceive and indeed compose and ensure a viable future, not just for us, this generation, but perhaps for complex life and sapient intelligence more generally, requires this, I think, this kind of shift in perspective. In other words, there are lots of futures. We each imply different kinds of futures. Gibson is correct that the futures are unevenly spread in different kinds of ways. At the same time, there are modes of futurity, let's say. There are planetary futures that we all ultimately share, that we are all ultimately bound to, whether we and I think part of what the challenge of the moment is to reorient the project of the present in relationship to those.
I'm going to take a question from an audience member, Frank Fremery, pushing back completely, saying, is planetary scale computation not a fiction? Countries like China filter access or build walls. Will we have a planetary scale bubble tea instead? I suppose you have to be familiar with bubble tea to understand what he's getting at. I mean, he's suggesting that because we have these walled gardens like China, that there is no commonality.
Yeah. So, well, he's not wrong. This is in fact true. What I mean by planetary scale computation is not that there is one single system that we are all participating in exactly the same way, or that there's some kind of singular structure around this as well. But the fact that we are even talking, and in fact, I would argue and have argued in a lot of the work that what we are seeing is a kind of splitting of geopolitical regimes, the geopolitical landscape into this kind of multi-hemispherical, multipolar array that is, as the commentator implies, increasingly enclosed in certain regards. But what we must see is that these enclosures are themselves enclosures around computational apparatuses, such that the geopolitical domain and the computational domain of what data is produced, what data is modeled, what data is used as a governing structure, are in essence isomorphic to one another. There isn't a difference. The difference between the Chinese geopolitical hemisphere and the Chinese computational hemisphere are, as the speaker implies, overlapping in such a way that it becomes clear, or should become clear, that it's not simply a matter of a geopolitics of computation, but rather that computation has become the engine of the geopolitical transformation, geopolitical segmentation, geopolitical enclosure, competition, and so forth. So on the one hand, this is it. Planetary scale computation as a hypothesis includes this internal segmentation. Second, however, the emergence of planetary scale, the emergence of, as I suggested, of climate science really in the 60s and 70s brought with it the disclosure of a kind of understanding of planetarity itself as an object of scientific analysis, and increasingly one of political thought and theorization. That is, no matter how much the humans try to subdivide the surface of the Earth or the atmosphere and so forth into jurisdictional domains and construct both physical and symbolic barriers to one another, the underlying planetary condition, astronomic condition, ecological condition of the perch that we share among us remains. It remains indifferent to a certain extent to those kinds of machinations, in the same way the virus remained indifferent to the kinds of narratives and symbols that we might have wanted to project upon it during the pandemic. Ultimately, at the end, reality wins, and the reality is that our common planetarity drives and curtails any of other such projects we might want to pursue.
I want to pick up on a question that's coming in through our chat as well. That I recently interviewed Shoshana Zuboff, and she points out in her digital capitalism approach that she's very surveillance capitalism. She's very keen to point the finger, in fact, at the business model, at the companies, at the very practical big tech elements of it. And I feel that you're maybe not going quite in that same direction. One of the questions here is, Benjamin says that Europe's political future is bound up with its digital infrastructure, but right now a lot of that infrastructure is run and designed by big tech. Should the EU then not start building its own digital infrastructure to replace Facebook, for example, or a European public sphere? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, lovely question. So first of all, let me take the Zuboff one. My argument is not, I agree, as I tried to make clear, I agree with 80% of everything Zuboff says in her critique about the role of the big platforms in this regard. I would also then suggest that to a certain degree, it's not just a matter of sort of reforming the model by which we have large platforms that understand the role is primarily about the modeling and mediation of individual consumers, whether those are foreign, whether those American or European, public or private. The fundamental mistake is the construction of planetary scale computation around the individual as this core unit of analysis in this regard. And I think this has driven the surveillance conversation into some really muddled territory. So to be clear, it's not that I see my position as sort of contradictory to Zuboff's, it's that I don't think Zuboff goes far enough in the critique of the model of what we have. Now, to the question of the sort of European platforms around this as well. Sure, I think having more versions is a greater heterogeneity of structures around this will allow for further development. But I also don't see it as really ultimately the bigger project. I don't think there's a way to fix Facebook. I think Facebook as a model of society, as sort of atomized individuals signifying to one another with central algorithms structuring. I think the fundamental model is broken. So I don't think it matters ultimately in a certain sense whether they come from Menlo Park or Brussels, if the mechanism itself is structured in such a way. What I was suggesting is that Europe's role in the construction and steerage and administration and governance and conceptualization of the planetary scale computation that we all in many ways would want to see, goes beyond that. That Europe, the European vision for what these infrastructures can be, how these infrastructures might be steered in directions that are more productive, that actually address the kinds of the needs for the forms of social self-composition that are necessary in relationship to biopolitical questions such as the pandemic, ecological questions in relationship to climate change, political questions in relationship to migration and the future of citizenship. These are the fundamental issues that, as a planetary society, we need to be adjudicating in one way or another. And so for those, we need very different kinds of systems. It doesn't just simply having a Facebook-like system that's based inside of Europe's borders will not get us any closer to that as well. But to be clear, I think Europe has a lot to do, has an important role to play in the development and conceiving of those systems we do need.
I mean, surely we could fix everything that's wrong with Facebook just by changing its name.
Yeah, indeed, and also strapping Second Life to our face. What could go wrong?
Absolutely. I have another question from our audience. Philip Staub is saying, is what you suggest a program of progress or adaptation? If adaptation, are we outside of modernity if we go along with it?
There's always that both. In terms of the question of adaptation or I guess progress was the other with as well, or adaptation or replacement, or adaptation or mitigation, or this as well. It's clearly both. Like at the same time, I'm arguing that the uses of planetary scale computation as advertising platforms, as consumer platforms on the one hand, versus the model of it as I'm using climate science as a sort of the alternative model that we already have for uses of a similar kind of infrastructure. Indeed, the infrastructure that drives climate science and the infrastructure that drives Google are in many ways quite similar. What the issues at hand then, as I'm suggesting with, for example, my example of carbon removal, clearly is one of adaptation. It's adaptation of there are existing infrastructures that can be redirected and repurposed for much more essential projects, and it may very well be that the repurposing of those systems is a much more realistic approach than to try to literally physically dismantle them and replace them in some way as well. And so, to a certain extent, I'm arguing against a technological determinist position that would say, here is this technology, this is this machine, this is what it must do, this is what its social outcome necessarily is. I am suggesting, in fact, no, there are many other things that this infrastructure is capable of doing. There are many other things that the mechanisms that we've inherited are capable of doing on our behalf. And their repurposing is essential. This, to a certain extent, puts me, I recognize, as a little bit at odds with some other tech critics who might argue in a way that here's what AI is being used for today. Therefore, that is what AI is. AI is this thing that it is being used for today. And I will argue, take a step back. In fact, no, we shouldn't confuse initial implementation for ontology. And I think the history of technology demonstrates the point. And so it's clearly in this regard, the approach that we would want to stand for.
Well, I'm minded of Kranzberg's first law that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral.
Oh, no, it's both. It's both good. Mine or the Socrates and the Pharmacon. It's both remedy and poison. It always will be, for sure. So I think this is part of it. But I would also just reiterate the point that speaking of the previous speaker asked of sort of modernity, like that one of the common, I think, sort of symptoms of the way in which modernity thought through the question of technology was a strong differentiation of the political on the one side and the technological on the other. as if the technology was here and we would need to apply a political vision to it. But quite clearly, the very notion of what a polity is, how and what constitutes this, is something that is in many ways always determined by different modes of its technological milieu. That has always been the case. And so I think looking forward towards the kinds of systems that we need to be conceiving, the kinds of geopolitics that we might need might look to us very much like geotechnologies. And the kinds of geotechnologies we might need may look to us very much like geopolitics. And I think that the sooner that we get used to that what may seem like a kind of hybridization or convergence, the better.
Well, thank you, Benjamin. We're actually right at the end of your time of intervention, so thank you very much for that. It's been fascinating. I could talk to you for another hour and a half, but I'm aware it's slightly the middle of the night where you are. So we are going to. We're going to take a very short break here, and we're going to come back in about 5 minutes with our panel discussion. We're going to talk about being autonomous and the EU's specific vision for the digital decade. So don't go far, maybe grab a coffee, and we'll be back in 5 minutes.
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
So this panel discussion is called Being Autonomous, the EU's Vision for the Digital Decade. Now, we've heard a lot here in Brussels about the digital transition, something that is very much at the forefront of what the Commission wants to do. But we're going to talk more broadly about what this sort of progression really means for progressives in general, and what can we do. And so we're talking about the call for digital autonomy, or what we've even called digital sovereignty. There's lots of different elements to this that can be accused of ring fencing or creating walled gardens that maybe don't solve global planetary scale problems, as we just heard Benjamin talking about. We're also going to look at a little bit the Digital Compass 2030 mechanism, this proposal, and see whether it's going to rise to the challenge or not, what we need to do, what we need to talk about in terms of reframing the discussion as well. So we've seen an awful lot of legislation in recent months. We've seen the Digital Services Act, the Data Governance Act, the Digital Markets Act. There's a lot happening as politicians and policymakers try to grapple with a lot of what Benjamin spoke about in his introductory speech, a lot about this changing world, this digitized world, this global computational system that we live within. So we're going to have an introductory statement from each of our speakers, and then we'll get into the conversation. As before, please do use the Q&A function if you're following on Zoom, or use the message box if you're following us online by one of the other platforms to send your questions to our speakers. You should indicate to which speaker they're addressed, and if it's for the whole panel, you can also say that as well. Again, please do use the hashtag DigiCap in order to spread the word widely. I know we can all join in from across Europe. And again, there is translation available for those following on Zoom. You can go to the bottom of the screen and you'll find there a globe-like icon, and you can select English, German, French, Spanish, or Italian as you wish. So with that, I'm very pleased that we have with us Francesca Bria, who is the president of the Italian National Innovation Fund and honorary professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London. Paul Tang is a MEP known very well to all of us from the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. And Sabine Pfeiffer is professor of the chair of sociology encompassing technology, work and society at the Nuremberg campus of technology of the Friedrich Alexander University. So thank you all very much for being with us. Francesca, perhaps I could start with you. Give me your opening statement, set out your stall, tell me where you feel your intersection is with this big debate we're having.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be here. So first of all, let me say that to reconnect with what I've heard from Benjamin, I think this conversation probably will bring us back to what kind of pragmatic political program do we need to enact now if we want to even conceive that in the future a planetary computation will be used for a productive and emancipatory use. So I think I will start from the question of regulation And then I will argue that, of course, the EU needs to go beyond being seen as a regulatory superpower. And I will focus on digital industrial strategy and what we need to do forward in order to make sure that the next generation plan, which will invest a lot of public money into digitization, can help us to achieve progressive goals. So when it comes to what the EU tech regulation is doing, I think we are moving in the right direction. And I also think that an international consensus is emerging around the need to regulate big tech. Big tech companies cannot handle all the power they have at mass. And I think even in the last week with the whistleblower from Facebook in the European Parliament, with Google 2.4 billion euro antitrust decision, it is clear that we have a momentum to regulate digital platforms. I also think that the Digital Market Act and the Digital Governance Act in particular will strengthen policies related to competition and antitrust in order to curb the market dominance of big tech, which today is a real concern. During the pandemic, big tech had a positive shock, contrary to the rest of the industry. The major digital players today have a stock market value of more than 9 to 10 trillion US dollars. So we must ensure as progressives that the development of digital capitalism does not result in irreversible forms of economic concentration. How do we do that? I think as regulators, as policymakers, we need to act much quicker and we need to be bolder, because we had 20 years of big tech dominance and there is an emergency. There is an emergency from a competition standpoint, which has been killed. And also the industry is moving very fast and they're continuously creating big and new problems for the economy, for the environment, and for society that we struggle to address. So regulators need to be still too slow, seem to be too slow, playing catch up and often intimidated, even to give a kind of big picture on what we need to do. So it is the time now to show real leadership in the EU if we have so. I think that the DMA, for example, just let me go into some examples, it is too narrow. For example, we have to make sure that it integrates merger control to deal with killer acquisitions, since we know that dominance and market power can be explained through acquisitions. The GAFAM in the past 20 years have acquired around 1,000 companies. It's a really large number, and no mergers have been ever questioned by competition authority globally. So we also need to intervene because we need to fix an anti-competitive business model that is harming users and citizens' digital rights, what you have been referring before as surveillance capitalism. So in order to do that, enforcing competition law is important, but we need to move beyond antitrust and competition toolbox. And as I said at the beginning, we cannot only be seen as a regulatory superpower. So the focus, real focus, I think, should be on how we build a proper digital industrial strategy and how we make sure that this large-scale investment will help us to regain digital sovereignty, given the strong current geopolitical dimension. To be clear then, Europe needs its own digital champions that can compete in platform-based digitization and are able to take control over the technological stack that will enable us to develop future critical services and applications in mobility, energy, deep tech, and climate change. So Europe needs to build alternatives to Chinese technology manufacturing monopolies and to US-based intellectual property and digital payment monopolies. This means that either we manufacture the critical technologies we need ourselves here in Europe, or we must be able to ensure long-term access to them and from a wide range of different sources without depending on the import of raw materials and rare earth. And I say this because the future of green energy in Europe and our ability to comply with the EU Green Deal also depends on that. And I think we are seeing today that the European Cloud Act, for example, which is setting the goal of producing at least 20% of the world's semiconductors in Europe by 2030, and even release more state aid to do that, so in order to fund new chip makers and new green projects, is already moving beyond the kind of tools that we're using today in order to achieve those goals. So I think the real conversation, and I would like to have it in this panel, is that Europe has put forward an ambitious 2 to 3 trillion plans to recover from the pandemic at the moment. And 20% of the COVID recovery and resilience facility is going in digitization, which means in critical technologies and infrastructures such as ultra broadband networks, 5G, cloud, AI, microprocessors, and cybersecurity. How can we make sure that we build a European way towards our digital future that goes beyond big tech and big state, which is, as I've defined it, a big democracy, a new digital humanism that helps us to combine innovation with the defense of autonomy, democracy, sustainability, and self-determination. In my view, this European way should be based on open source technology, data portability, sovereignty and sharing, privacy preserving standards and protocol, and reconciling antitrust and privacy, algorithmic transparency and accountability. So we need a clear way forward to protect citizens' rights, to protect workers' rights, and to make sure that the digital transition help us to address the big challenges such as the climate crisis that we are living today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You've covered a lot of ground there quite quickly. So I'm going to come back over the course of our discussion and pull out lots of different bits of that. But what I'd like to do now is turn to Paul and get your thoughts, Paul. I know this is an area you follow quite closely as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be after Francesca. She already set out the agenda, I think, in very good terms. But let me come back to our keynote speaker and saying, I think it used to be that in a certain sense the future was understood as something to be achieved. Today, however, the future is something to be prevented. And also the reference to round number, the year 2000. When I heard that, I thought also 1984, which is not a round number to start with, but also a future to be prevented. And much of the work currently in the European Parliament is in fact, I'm afraid, on the future to be prevented. And this is why I like the introduction very much of Francesca, because we need to, as progressives, to think beyond what is to be prevented, but also imagine the future, how we would like it to be and how what we aim for. That's not always easy to do, I admit that, but I think it's important. But let me start with the present, because from the future follows the present, so to say. And the present situation is that we are very much dominated by big tech. The progressive group is really fighting in the European Parliament to curb the power of big tech. And I think that's essential to make sure that, because that paves the way for more European initiatives. Currently, the market power of big tech is that huge, it stands in the way of future developments. Now, that is very much related. So what we aim for example, is to break down the tracking and targeting of users through for advertisement. That's the business model of Google and Facebook, and that's the 80% I agree with Zuboff. That's part of the surveillance economy, and that is not only to the detriment of our privacy. I think it also leads to a system where we see the dissemination of fake news, the breeding of conspiracy theories. So it's intoxicating our society, while at the same time it impoverishes our traditional media. Right? Don't forget that Google and Facebook take roughly, of every euro that is spent on advertising, they take roughly 50 cents. And that is very much to the impoverishment of the traditional media, the newspapers, the broadcast companies. So what we see is that puts also a pressure on the democracy. On the one hand, we see it intoxicating, the public discourse is intoxicated through social media, where we see that commotion pays off. And on the other hand, the traditional media are more and more impoverished. And this changes our public discourse. Now the fight, so as progressive group in the European Parliament, we have very much fighting against the tracking and target of users, but we need, of course, to find the majority and also convince the others. And that is interesting to see that this is also part of our political work, but it's very interesting to see that it's for us very difficult to break through the idea of the liberal idea that the government should not interfere into private business. For example, this week, in fact yesterday, I was having a discussion with Margaret Vestager, who said that Facebook is very helpful for small and medium-sized enterprises, for SMEs, to develop their business, taking on the discourse that is being promoted almost everywhere, advertised almost everywhere by Facebook. And we need to break through that to really arrive at a major change. Having said that, I think, by the way, one element I would like to mention is that the Digital Market Act, yes, it has limitation in the sense that we can't really go into, for example, killer acquisitions, what Francesca meant, but we also managed to establish the idea of interoperability, which I think is very important because it allows competition and diversity at the core service of big tech. If we can't break them up, let's break them open. So this is for our listeners and viewers a sort of overview of the debate that we had just this week in the European Parliament. But let me look forward. What I'm deeply concerned about, it's like I say, the demise of the traditional media and the public discourse on the new social media. And that is the one thing that we need to change. We see a polarization in our society. But I can't help but think that that polarization in society has also very much to do how we have organized or how big tech has organized the social media. And in that sense, I find it interesting that we see an investment program in Europe that is aimed at bringing skills to individuals, that is aimed to build infrastructure, for example, the 5G network, that is aimed also at making sure that businesses have access to, for example, cloud services from Europe, but is not really aimed at the idea that we need a public space in which the media can operate, and a public space that we share where we can have a discussion that is not intoxicating, that is not just led by commotion, but leads to a real exchange with among people. And this is, I think, essential for our public discourse to survive as part of our democracy. So I would very much like to make a plea that in Europe, we don't only need investment in, let's say, the individual skills or in the hardware. We also need to make sure that we invest in the media in a broader sense, both traditional and new. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, indeed. And I know later on today, there is a discussion on new politics as part of the Global Progressive Forum in the European Parliament. So anyone who's interested in that element of our discussion, do tune in for that. Sabine Pfeiffer, you're coming at this from an academic perspective. Give me your thoughts, your suggestions, and indeed your opening remarks to what you've heard so far.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. The 2030 Digital Compass claims goals as tech-focused when it refers to cloud or chips and even unicorns. And I would not consider cloud, chips and unicorns as tech-focused in the first place. Cloud is infrastructure. Chips are about, as we all experience at the moment, about supply chain resilience. So here we assume interests of capital on one hand, but also of citizens on the other. But unicorns, that's a total different story. They are not a phenomenon of technological innovation very often, not even of digital capitalism in a kind of a technological sense, but of kind of good old capitalism gone wild. Currently, literally 2 days ago, we count 907 unicorns worldwide, 907 companies, each burning at least $1 billion venture capital, and trust me, they will burn it. By the way, unicorns are history already. We are seeing more and more decacorns valued over $10 billion and even hectacorns valued over 100 billion. Collectively, we are talking about almost $3,000 billion amounted in those 907 companies. And of course, you assume it, only 7% of these companies are located within the European Union. But the critical question is not how can we have more of them in Europe? The critical question, I think, is why did we allow people to accumulate so much money that they could invest in such amazing, huge amounts of money in what is very often yet another business model? Business models mostly focused on what I call distributive forces, ensuring value realization on markets, which means helping accumulating even more huge amounts of money in even fewer hands. This could not at all be the interest of European citizens. So are recovery funds going digital, something that will lead to meaningful autonomy? Yes, true. On one hand, of course, funds are spent nationally, so it's taxpayers' money, so taxpayers should have a say in it. And this is an aspect of autonomy. But interestingly, also nations have some slightly different priorities, how they spend that money. The strategies are quite similar. And this is no coincidence, because the whisperers from the lobbying organizations and the dominant corporations sit at all decisive transnational political levels. This year, big tech takes European lobby spending to an all-time high of 100 million euro. Only spent on lobbying in the European Union, big tech. So if a national policy strategy were to take seriously different paths, it would be influenced verbally at first, but quickly through economic levers. Just imagine if a country in the European Union explicitly decided not to roll out 5G, for example, because it would rather invest the money in maybe construction of social housing, better working conditions for health workers, or a renaturation of monoculture forests. You only have to look at how the topic of internet-based production, what we later called Industry 4.0, in Germany was preconceived at the World Economic Forum, then orchestrated as a process by management consultancy companies into national policy strategies. This is not the autonomy of a policy that acts democratically in the interests of society. Nationally and internationally, politics does not act in the interest of the common good, but more and more in the interest of influential economic actors. This is not a conspiracy theory. I know it sounds like one. It is a conspiracy of economic interest in the open. You can see it. You can. There are the discourses there. Everything is there to see. And it's somehow combined with what you could call a Stockholm syndrome of the political caste, of politicians who are primarily and first and foremost concerned about the interests of the big economic players, but not about society, and, by the way, not about the functioning of the economy, the normal economy in its truest sense. So could public infrastructure funding spur new governance debate beyond centralization and so on? The economy, but even more to society, of course, infrastructure is key and always has been. Those who give infrastructure out of their hands endanger sovereignty and, of course, their strategic capability. Anyone who sells both, in the truest sense, sells it, undermines democracy. This is not more obvious since COVID-19, but has been happening at the political level for decades. Not by accident, not as unintended consequences, but as prevailing policy. Politics sells off the commons, leaves it to the market, and thus gives up the levers that secure the ability to shape the future. This is a process that has been going on for decades and will probably only end when all commons have been sold. The current discussion in the German coalition negotiations at the moment show how absurd this is. We want to create sustainable mobility. And now, of all times, we want to break up the Bundesbahn and push for a separation of infrastructure from actual rail operations. Incidentally, that what we now call the internet was also once in state hands. As early as the 1950s, the process began of dismantling telecommunications. Worldwide, policymakers abandoned public service policies and dropped national welfarist controls over this critical infrastructure. This is not a consequence of digital capitalism. It made digital capitalism possible in the first place. Now add to this fact that the platform economy itself acts on the one hand as a parasite of existing commons, and on the other hand, platform economy works on a future where no social and no economic exchange whatsoever, from logistics to job placement, from mobility to health, will be possible without using their digital infrastructures for everything. Infrastructures which are exclusively in private hands and of companies whose headquarters are usually located in other national legal systems outside the European container. Not that there is much regulatory interest at all. If we do not stop this process now, we will never be able to get back control. As you imagine, I will not provide that concrete regulatory ideas. We have to try everything that's out there and the other talked about, of course. But there are some policy strategies we see even more in California than in Europe that more and more try to regulate some Silicon Valley players. In some respects, regulate them. That is fine, but quite late and not at all what we need. We need not to regulate some black sheeps. We have to tame the worst sides of today's capitalism while at the same time develop policies to initiate a degrowth economy, which in its heart is not at all compatible with digital capitalism, because digital capitalism is about scaling and is about ubiquitous consumption. First step, we have to acknowledge that we live in kind of a hijacked democracy and we need to get back control. Let's talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, an awful lot to unpack there, Sabine. So let me, if you like, start with the low-hanging fruit. You mentioned lobbying. I want Paul to quickly just comment on that because of the position you're in, Paul. And then we'll move aside and deal more substantively with the overall topic.
Yeah, no, Sabine used the word Stockholm syndrome. And this is also, I used the term I used in a discussion I had with advertisers. It's what you have seen is since we are aiming to break down the ad-based business model of tracking and targeting users. We see a fierce pushback from most notably Facebook, with a large public campaign on every channel, in advertisements on social media, but also on Twitter, advertisement in newspapers. So there's a severe pushback. But I realized along the way that publishers and advertisers have become so dependent on Facebook and Google, on this advertising ecosystem, that they help also to the lobby of Google and Facebook. And also advertisers push back, and this is the point that I used the Stockholm syndrome in a discussion with advertisers. And you must realize that many of the publishers and advertisers have embedded employees of Google and Facebook how to make best use of the algorithms. And they are become so dependent that they fear a change in the advertising system. We promote, for example, the idea of contextual advertising. They fear so much this change that they fall in line with Google and Facebook. And this is why also the reason why I was somewhat appalled to hear Margaret Vestager, the commissioner, say that the targeted ads help the SMEs, because that is the discourse that's pushed forward by Facebook. So yeah, of course, we do our best to, we organize also a coalition of many MEPs and NGOs. It's the Tracking Free Ad Coalition, because we saw this coming. And this week I had a discussion with Anja Schifrin and with her husband Joe Stiglitz that's joined this coalition. So we also find support, but we need that support to against this massive lobby in many places of Google and Facebook.
Thank you. I think possibly, as we say, there's nothing new under the sun. This is sort of, we've seen this sort of pressure since even back in the days of putting together the GDPR, this huge lobbying machine that is rolled out across Brussels. Let's move on a little bit, Francesca, to another question. The Digital Compass 2030 that is set out has got very tech-focused solutions or aspirations. And are we in danger of trying to force a technological solution on a cultural problem?
Thanks for the question. I actually think we should, for a little while, focus. Yes, I mean broadly, yes. I think here we all know that when we talk about technology, it's not technological solutionism. It's not the technology itself. It is about the creation of the critical future institutions of our society, and this involves the infrastructure itself, which underpins critical services of society, from healthcare to to cities and mobility, to education, to the data to fight climate change, and everything that pertains in our kind of welfare system. And then also the way those infrastructures and new technological facilities are organized, which means the economic and social model. So, this is about deciding on the social and economic model that Europe wants in the future. So just to briefly answer your question, I think what's emerging in this conversation, I mean, for me, there are two main critical points. The first one, it's really for the progressives. I mean, for me, it is absolutely critical to have analysis like what Sabine just did, or what like broader, understanding of why we are here, where we are, what's the problem with the current capitalism, and how we can move forward. However, we also have to have pragmatic programs, political pragmatic programs, and fight for those right now, because otherwise we risk of seeing things like happening today, which is massive public investment going into digitization of all kinds of basic infrastructure in Europe. I mean, we are digitalizing everything. We're digitalizing access to basic services, payment system, digital identities, basic services from education to healthcare to smart working, which is really, we are creating the infrastructure for, future society right now. And we need a vision and a political program on how to do that. So basically what I'm saying is that if we allow the more or less 400 billion euros investment in Europe, that it's going to digitization, to be put to basically go in the same kind of big tech incumbent players, which are not even European. We invest a lot in startups, but we don't have a strategy on how those services that will be developed by the startup can then bring, redistribution of wealth in society. We don't have a strategy of underpinning critical infrastructures that must be public in society. So I think we need to have those ideas right now. So how are we going to spend this investment, which is coming from Europe? I mean, this is mainly left to the nation states at the moment. So I think that even what Paul is saying, if the regulatory effort is happening at the EU level, anyways, you need to bring the member states with you, because they have the resilience and facility plan, which is being deployed right now. And we need the member states to, to basically bring together this kind of regulatory vision, which says, okay, Europe goes beyond the surveillance capitalist model. We don't want targeted advertising. We want the Data Governance Act to, allow for public interest data to produce public value. I mean, all these kind of things, they have to become a national digital industrial strategy. because we need to understand how to do it. And at the moment, I mean, as also Sabine says, we lost this capacity. I mean, the critical infrastructure, yes, it is in the hands of the big tech players. It is largely privatized, and we need to recuperate some of that back. I mean, this is basically my argument. Then I would like to also comment on what Paul said, this question of the public electronic sphere, of the public, we need a public digital sphere that's not colonized by a business model that's basically, based on the monetization and manipulation of personal information and data. And those algorithms are actually created to optimize profit, not to, create a better society with pluralism, with independent thinking, with independent information, with democratic capacity to engage democratically. So on that front, just quickly, two things. I mean, first of all, just so that you are aware, Europe at the moment is running the future conference, the conference on the future of Europe, which is, I know, I mean, not many politicians are actually really on the case, but thousands and thousands of citizens have been called to participate to shape the future agenda of Europe. So it is an exercise of participatory democracy. It is using a platform that we actually built in Barcelona some years ago. It is open source. It is built with ethics, privacy, and security by design. It's European technology. There is data sovereignty. It belongs to the citizens, and the algorithms actually are really about empowering citizens and not maximizing profit. So this should be promoted. I mean, this is a way that Europe is doing participatory democracy and preserving a public digital sphere that I think it's really important. And then, yes, I mean, at the moment, I even sit on the board of Rai TV in Italy. So I'm particularly interested in any thinking on how to bring the public broadcast media, our traditional media, into become a player that is preserving a digital public sphere for democracy, for the citizens right now in the 21st century. So this is a particularly important topic, and I think we can bring the public service media together to basically brainstorm about what kind of role they can have in order to do that.
Francesca, you mentioned how we are digitizing everything, as you say, even from access to public services. Do we need a right to switch off? Do we need a right to not be connected?
Well, yes. I mean, actually, the right to disconnect is now being discussed by many countries, for example, related to the smart working regulation, because as we know, we moved rapidly into distance working, and people are using digital tools to connect from home and do their job. And the unions are proposing that the right to disconnect will be part of the institutional framework that is going to regulate that. I think we will need the right to disconnect, but basically, I mean, we need, we need to build technologies that embed this right to disconnect in the way that the technology is built, because, these type of technologies do not allow us to disconnect, because our data is continuing to be monetized, our attention is monetized, and the more we are online, and, the better it is for the big tech giants. So it is about the business model. I mean, me and Paul said it, Sabine also said it, and basically, if you do not change that, there is not going to be capacity and incentive to actually do what you're saying. And I think we need privacy preserving protocols and standards and open standards that will enable people to take more democratic control over those kind of technologies, which is about information self-determination. It is about that. It is preserving information self-determination and the basic fundamental rights of people in the digital age. So it's not just the right to disconnect, it's basically the ability of having rights, fundamental rights in the digital age. And you have these wonderful rights to information self-determination, which I think condensed what we mean in a very important way.
Thank you. Sabine, you mentioned in your opening comments that there are no unintended consequences. As we might say in tech circles, it's a feature, not a bug. This idea that we entrap people into an ongoing vicious cycle of using a tool. And what I'm wondering is, how could we trust businesses? We always say businesses are in the business of making money. That is their aim. That is the function of them in a capitalist society. And Frank Fremery has asked another question, and he's asked, how do we stop turning public goods into private property? I would love to hear your response to that.
Yes, that's the main question at the moment. And on one hand, the answer is pretty easy. Politicians just have regulate what's going on. So, but as we know, we could do this. We are living in democracies, and we have politicians who should be in charge and willing to do this. But as we see and talked about, there are a lot of reasons why a lot of politicians, of course, we also have the other ones, the progressive ones, but as we all know, this is not the mainstream approach in politics. And I think we really have to talk about that really earnest. If you look, because there was one question about this, and this is a fitting example. If you look into Gaia X, it sounds like a nice idea, and it was a nice idea. It still has nice ideas in its core. Having a kind of autonomy infrastructure, which is European, which has European norms and ideas of how democracy and society and so on, and also markets should work. So if you look further into it, it's not so much about commons. It's not so much about the common goods and what people want. It's in the first place, it's about profits of European big players, which of course are somehow anxious to be gone in the future. And it's about national economies who also want to be still part in the economies of the future, in the global economy. And they all together going into one direction, and this direction is more profits and growth. And as long as we don't stop this, we have really, it's not only about society and the social things and people, of course, that should be on the first place of the agenda, but it's also about classical ideas of how markets should function. We will lose all small kind of economies in the long run if we don't do something now. So I think we need different coalitions between political strategies that normally see each others as the others. For example, in Germany, we still have the reflex to think about that the small company owner, if you look on him or her from a leftist perspective, it's a capitalist. Yes, maybe he or she is a capitalist in the economic sense, but he or she is also kind of endangered due to this economy we are moving into. So maybe we have to go together and make coalitions with people, and actors normally don't come into coalition, and we should further that. We should bring the classical economy in opposition to what's going on there. And we have all the levers to do so, but politics really have to wake up, even those politics who still think growth is the first thing we have to look into, and everything else comes trickle down and so on later. We don't have time anymore. It's almost the same, I would say, dramatic tipping point we are heading to, like we maybe have already gone over in the climate and the ecological catastrophe.
Well, Paul, politicians must regulate what's going on. It's all on your shoulders. You must sort it out. Give me a reaction to that. I also am interested, from what Sabine said, perhaps we need new KPIs for countries, new key performance indicators, and it shouldn't all be about economics.
Yeah, well, let me I share the sense of urgency of Sabine, right? Have we reached the tipping point? Well, I'm a politician, so it's in my job description to be optimistic. So I assume we don't have to reach that tipping point, and we can still change course along the way. And I think this discussion is, I hope, for me, very helpful also for the audience. Well, first, what you try to do is to show the impact of private operations on the public sphere. For example, in the Digital Service Act, there will be more transparency on the effects of algorithms on our society, and that may help. And that's, I think, it's an important step. The algorithms are currently a black box. I agree with Francesca. They are dominated by profits, but we can now better show what the impact is on society, because we all share that we don't want the algorithms to not to discriminate, to be fair, and so on. So that's one step that may help us and also change the public discourse. At the same time, we need to not just try to limit, to embed the current market into our society. We only also need to change it. That's why we need better alternatives. In that sense, I very much agree with Francesca. We need specific ideas to put forward, and the platform that Francesca put forward is one of these examples. I also see examples in my country, the Netherlands, and I think we need to promote them as a way to show the alternative. For example, in the Netherlands, there's public spaces, which is a network, which is not-for-profit, cooperative in a way, and essentially set up in an entirely different way than the current platforms owned by the American big tech are. So that helps. The problem with what I see when I go to the level of the member states is that the member states are now still in a situation where they have the concerns, and these concerns are shared across member states, but how to come up with a coordinated response, it's too big for them, so to say. So what you see is that the response mainly comes from the European level, although there are some, for example, national supervisors that do really good work. And that means that because the digital sphere is, let's say, global European, and the member states do not match up to that. So this is what I see, that at the level of the member states, the discussion is not always what it should be. It's more focused on the national interest. And this is not national, this is global. Our public digital sphere is global in nature. And I don't see member states taking that into account. And it's especially coming back, just one point on, for example, on Gaia X, I still have sympathy to put the idea forward of a European alternative for cloud services. What I find striking, that we do that to arrive at strategic autonomy, but we don't do that with media, right? So there's completely lacking. And I always find it very instructive to think how we dealt with in the past with radio, with television, and newspapers. We always make sure there was diversity and independence at the same time. And that idea has been lost. And well, if we want to restore that, and I think that's critical for our democracy, to have a good role of media, traditional and new, we need to step up to the plate and invest in that as well. But this is where the specific projects come in.
Well, thank you. And thank you for mentioning Gaia X, and we had a question about that as well. So I think that's been addressed. We also mentioned, more than once, we've mentioned her, Margaret Vestager. And this question of protectionism, when she was seen as competition commissioner formerly for going after big tech, she was accused by the US of being purely motivated by national interests, or if you like, bloc interests of Europe versus the US. So I want to talk a little bit about that. First, however, I'm going to come to Francesca, because there's been a very specific question to you, asking you, could you perhaps tell us what is the open source technology to be used at the Conference of Europe?
Sorry, the open source technology? That is used for the, well, it's called decidim.org. decidim.org, and then you can search for the Conference on the Future of Europe and see the instance which is used by the European Commission, European Parliament, and Council for that. It's translated in all European languages. You can just use it. It's an open source participatory democracy platform that was built in Barcelona and now scaled up to European and global level.
Thank you. That was just a question from one of our YouTube viewers, so helpful to be able to answer it. But can you come back to this question of digital sovereignty versus the allegations, if you like, or the accusations of protectionism?
Yes. Well, first of all, just one little thing on what we discussed before. I think even beyond asking just Paul what policymakers can actually do and why policymakers are not doing enough and so on, I think it would be also interesting to understand why people, if we are at that tipping point with big tech dominance and monopoly power, and also vis-a-vis the kind of climate crisis, why we're not seeing global movements like the ones we're seeing, protesting for the climate crisis and the environmental disaster, why we're not seeing the same happening when it comes to understanding the shift that we need in our kind of the way we are digitalizing society. Also, I think for me, that's a big question. I mean, we haven't been able to repoliticize the question of technology and to get to people understand what's at stake. So those conversations have remained very much so conversations about technology, about, for technology experts, about privacy, about, regulated big tech, about social media, but really failed in getting people engaged and involved in understanding that this is going to impact, their housing, affordable housing. I mean, I used to be a CTO in the city of Barcelona, and we've seen how it has been absolutely important to deal with these issues with Airbnb and the kind of concrete impact this business model has on preserving affordable housing. We know how it is important for public transportation and the shift towards, electric, sustainable mobility, how we need to decarbonize our cities and how that's connected to those kind of issues. Participatory democracy and the very core of how do we intend to live in a democratic society. There are very big political questions that are linked to how we are actually thinking about the future of technology in its political meaning. And we have not been able to get people on board, unions, political parties, citizens, to bring this coalition together, that it's going to demand change. Because otherwise it's very hard for Paul to be in the European Parliament and do this kind of battles if we don't understand. I mean, if there is not this kind of bottom-up change request, as we see from the climate movement. So maybe we also have to to think a little bit why this is not happening, and maybe try to change maybe the way we communicate those kind of things to people. Getting to your point, in my little introductory speech, I refer to antitrust as being narrow. This is not enough. We cannot solve the question of the business model of big tech if we only use antitrust and competition law. And I think even the example I made on, for example, now with the releasing state aid restrictions to invest in microchips and to invest in green projects is a signal that also the European Commission is understanding that those kind of limitations in the state intervention in the economy, it is really not helping Europe to catch up. It's not helping Europe to compete, with China and the US. It's actually cutting our legs, because we have to be clear here. The scale of these companies is so big that we need to mobilize our industry. And I mean, this is also a question for Sabine. I mean, I think, yes, we do need a change in the development model, which is really about decarbonizing, which is really about changing the kind of, even the foundation of this capitalist system. But we need to do it with our industries. I mean, we need to bring them on board because there is no other way that we can achieve those objectives. And then I think, the question is not protectionism. The question is building strategic autonomy as a bloc for Europe. And this is where, I think we need to use, basically be able to protect strategic technologies. And this is also, I think, a new intervention, when it comes to mergers and when it comes to acquisitions, making sure that, if you have a technology that's really critical in biotech or artificial intelligence or some green technologies that help us to develop a future hydrogen batteries or this kind of things, they stay in Europe. So we don't have the big giants coming and buy those companies that are mainly funded with public money actually in Europe. So we need to change the way that the state is involved in the economy. And this is happening, I think. I mean, we see it happening. We see these conversations and this regulation changing in Germany, in France, in Italy at the moment, at European level. So I don't know if I have responded to your question, but I think it's absolutely critical that we all go beyond this kind of approach, because otherwise we're not going to be able to compete, to be autonomous in this geopolitical context.
Well, thank you. I think you've actually moved the discussion on a little bit, and it feeds quite well in. We have a very good question from an audience member, Jan Erik Storstad, asking, would it be necessary as a specific training program or strategy to increase public sector basic digital competencies and capabilities in all policy areas, as well as those of politicians and their advisors? I think this is something that is raised quite a bit, because often there is this creation of mystery, this black box theory of, well, you couldn't possibly, as a non-technical person, understand how our algorithms work, which does put, I think, politicians a little bit on the back foot when they're told, oh, but we can't do that. And then, for example, we see under certain circumstances, to raise again the issue of Facebook, actually, if they do want to filter out certain content, they can do it when it suits them. So I think what Jan Erik here is suggesting is that if we had experts embedded in our public agencies or or with politicians, there might be more sophisticated policy making. Paul, let me get your thoughts on that, but I would actually like to hear, ladies, from you as well on this question.
Okay, thank you. Let me say I'm a bit double on that. What you often see is that we need to skill people to make sure that they understand that their privacy is at stake, right? So we individualize collective problems. That's my concern on this. I don't want to do that. And besides, my experience has been that technology is often used as a way to confuse the public and politicians, where it's not about the technology itself, it's about the embedding of the technology in our society to take on this old idea of the social market economy, where the markets are embedded in our society. So in that sense, the discussion is not new, it's age old, I would say. So don't be fooled by the technology. It's sometimes a way to obscure discussions. Having said that, of course, I think what you see is that, look at, for example, the Dutch Parliament or the European Parliament, the politicians want these skills also to be on board, right? And need these skills to be on board, especially because it's not that the technology itself is, let's say, incomprehensible, but some facts are hidden. So if you want to look at the advertising system, it's difficult to uncover the facts and how this market works, and you need people to dig deep and understand better. May I, Jennifer, come back to the US-EU relation, because that's, I think, a big question mark for me at one point. I sort of imagine the situation. We adopt, as European Parliament, a strict DMA, Digital Market Act, Digital Service Act. What will be the reaction on the side of the US? We see some strain. The relation between the EU and the US is sometimes strange. You can see that, for example, the digital service taxes or the carbon border adjustments. So why not in the area of the digital market regulation? The good thing is that I think the Biden administration is taking a different course, and I think an even more progressive course than Margaret Vestager is currently pursuing, although Margaret Vestager denies that. But what you see is that Joe Biden takes on not to say we need to protect the interest of consumers, say market concentration itself is not good, which is a broader approach to competition policy. It may help us, may not be enough, but it will help us to indeed reduce market concentration. The problem for market concentration is manifold, right? It's not just about consumers, it's also about a lobby like Facebook and Google. So market concentration and lobby are related. So that new approach by the Biden administration, plus the nomination of Lina Khan in the FTC, makes me a bit more optimistic that we can find a sort of common response on both sides of the Atlantic. But like I said, optimism is in my job description.
Thank you very much. Sabine, your thoughts on maybe whether we need to demystify some of the tech? Paul there used the word that is often used to confuse, deliberately confuse and obfuscate. What can we do about that?
Yes, I would stress this contradiction. We see both, and it's not so easy to see where is the technical argument obscuring, how Paul said, and distracting us from the core problems where we should look and where it's not like that. First thing, of course, is that enable people to have a talk in the discourse, and which means sometimes they have to learn more about what's going on the technical side, is always good, because it helps in every kind of level of discourse to not be so easy obscured and distracted. But of course, it's just one piece of what we have to do. And I would say what we need more is have those people and those NGOs and actors who are not just obscured big tech NGOs, but real NGOs who have a critical technical knowledge and look at what's going on from a perspective of privacy built in and all those things, sitting at the table and have a vote at the table. And pretty often, if you look in where the big tech is sitting, our big tech or the other big tech, doesn't matter, sitting at a table and deciding about what kind of technical standards they want to have in the future, and how to influence politics to bring this standard into the future. We should guarantee that critical technical people sit at the table. So often, I mean, we have decisions on the political level that, for example, have evidently consequences for labor rights, for conditions of labor, but no union people are sitting at the table. They can make comments afterwards, they do papers, they do studies with academia people like me, that's all fine, but when the decision is made, they have no critical vote. And I think we have to really think more about how can we build in really democracy in those circles and discourses and levels where decisions are prepared. And I think we could do some very concrete things about that, so that also politicians don't have to run to the technical competence people of the big tech, because pretty often they are the only people that seem to be around to explain what is deep learning and what is normal machine learning and things like that. That's all fine to know. But if only the big tech people are explaining it to you, maybe they explain what they want to explain, and you need the other tech advanced people on the table too with a critical perspective. And I think that they are out there. We could bring them in we tried it in Germany, for example, with the Corona app. They looked into, is their privacy built in? And now a lot of companies and politicians are saying, oh, those privacy things are really a pain in the ass. It's too slow, it costs too much money, and so on. But it's pretty important for people having privacy in such sensible things like health.
Well, I'm glad you raised it, Sabine. I followed very, very closely the GDPR, and I was told it was stood for goddamn privacy rules. And I got incredibly frustrated at all those emails I think we all received a few years ago saying, because of GDPR, we must do X, Y, Z. And what frustrated me was that a lot of it wasn't because of GDPR. A lot of what they were asking was already completely non-compliant with the pre-existing law. So there was a fig leaf being used from a legal point of view, as well as we sometimes see from a technical point of view. We've just got 5 minutes left, and I know we've covered a huge amount of ground, but there's still an awful lot more that we could say. So I will leave the opportunity to each of you then to highlight a final point, or you could raise a new one, or you can double down on something we've already said, but a final wrap-up remark before we hand over to closing. So Francesca, I think it's your turn. I will give you the floor. There's a lot of things we could have touched on regarding funding, regarding COVID-19, regarding cybersecurity, and all of this. I will let you determine your final.
Yeah. Just on this, the GDPR and why, it's working a bit clunky, that you have to do this and that, and the cookies directive, and you have to do this and that. I think it's because we don't invest enough in privacy enhancing technology that work, smoothly and have good user interface, and, give the privilege of people to use technology that protects their right. I mean, this is a fact. We have a lot of talent, a lot of capacity in Europe. The best privacy and security researchers are European. They most of the time have to go and work for big tech in Silicon Valley, but they are European. They're trained in European universities and research centers. They're usually funded by European R&D money. And then we let them go to work for big companies that are non-European because we don't invest as much in the talent that we have here. And we don't believe we can build technologies that protect our rights, as citizens, as workers, and the environment made in Europe. So I would insist to say it is good that we have a very strong regulatory approaches, that we built a digital constitution, a constitution for the digital times. And Europe is kind of doing that, I think, in a very coherent and sometimes even bold way. But this is not enough. So my pitch here is we have to invest in digital industrial strategy here in Europe, and that is not going to have to be only monetary investment, because we have the possibility now. It's very urgent with Next Generation EU. This money is finally getting there, but we need a strategy on how to make it happen. And this strategy can only be pan-European. So nation states have to be somehow, strategically capable of understanding that we need a pan-European digital industrial strategy, and that this has to be grounded, of course, in our idea for our digital future, that based on our rights and our principles and our values, so open protocols, open technology, interoperability, data portability, everything we're talking about. But we need to make it happen, because we need to reclaim fundamental stacks, starting from our data. Our data is not a commodity that can be monetized and manipulated in big tech giants platform. It has to be a common good, a public infrastructure on top of which we want to build public value. We have to reclaim the data of our citizens, and we can only do that if we have a strategy in place. I think, the question is how we make it happen, and this is the moment, because we have the money, and we need a shift in the model, in the economic and social model in post-pandemic times. So I think that's what we have to work on, and I hope we're going to have this kind of digital democratic Europe strategy in place. And I think this is a matter for the new coalition in Germany. It is a matter for people like Paul working in the European Parliament, but as Sabine is saying, broadly for unions, citizens, NGOs. I mean, it's really a political strategy that we need.
Thank you, Sabine. Let me hand over to you. Brief wrapping up remarks, please.
Yes, I try to really make it brief and not bring in what I said before, but one more point. I think what politics should, and politics also means we all, not only Paul, you, and those who are doomed to be optimistic. But what we really have to use more and more consequently is the reversal of to reverse the burden of proof. Pretty often, I think politics is too much involved to, for example, with privacy, to invent, to have ideas how privacy could be designed, not on the deep technical level, but pretty concrete. And then we make a kind of a legal surrounding to hope to make this happen, and a very bureaucracy approach mostly coming along with it. But what we need is more that we decide the principles that have to be built in, and then say to big tech and those who want to be on our markets, you have to prove and you have to show us how you are designing privacy in your products. And we will look and we will decide if it's good enough. So the burden of proof should last on their shoulders. But the principles, what they have to build and which kind of norms and societal standards should be built in, this has to come from us, from out of democracy structures. And I think we maybe we lost somehow in the way, not in the digital economy, but before, that this is what politics is about. We don't have to understand every technical detail, but we have to make pretty clear what are the norms that should be built in, and please show you to us how you did it. And that maybe is something we do too seldom and not consequently enough.
Thank you. Paul, brief closing remarks.
Yeah, and let me not try to add a point except to say that I like to see myself working at the heart of capitalism to change capitalism. So I work on taxation, on finance, and on data and tech. And what I find is that I'm not alone in working in this area. There are a lot of NGOs, people, professors working on this area. So when we were discussing the DMA, we had a lot of support from NGOs, from professors that were willing to lend their thoughts, look at text, and that has been very helpful, just to show what support we also get as politicians. I very much like this to have this discussion, to not just to focus on the current work of the European Parliament, but also to look forward, to look broader. And what I take also from this discussion is that we need to have better public engagement. What holds for politicians that sometimes technology obscures the problems, the basic problems that we deal with. That is also true for the general public, and I think that could be very helpful. For example, when I started to work on this area, we also designed a campaign at Suck. It was pretty simple. So try to get the general public involved in a campaign, in our campaign against tracking and targeting of users. Now, not sure that was a successful campaign, but let me just end with a call to action. If you think of ways to engage and organize the public, that is very welcome, because we need that to change the public discourse, and it will help our political work in our fight against big tech and for a common European digital future.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Sabine and Francesca, as well, for your thoughts and your comments throughout this whole discussion. I'd like to thank the audience for your questions. I know we didn't have a chance to get to all of them. One's just coming in, for example, suggesting me to talk a bit more about the global south or developing countries. There were questions on other areas that we could probably have got to, but in this length of time, we unfortunately can't solve all the problems, but I think we have maybe pointed in the direction of some of the solutions and engaged a bit more on the debate. So don't stop sharing and discussing using that hashtag DigiCap to keep your colleagues and your friends and those you think might be interested involved in the discussion. I want to thank FEPS for organising this, particularly in their Competence Centre on the Future of Work, who have been the lead department, if you like, for this final closing event. And now I'm going to hand over to say a final remarks and to wrap up this whole event to Maria João Rodrigues, who is the president of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Maria João, thank you so much. The floor is yours. I hand it over to you.
Many thanks, Sabine, and many thanks, Francesca, Sabine, and Paul. Look, we are now closing this great Congress on the digital agenda. And I'm so pleased that we managed to have a great Congress exploring so many issues and coming up with such a brilliant kind of conclusions. I'm right now in the headquarters of FEPS, the European Progressive Foundation, and I'm very pleased to close this Congress organized with a great partnership with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation and the delegation in Brussels. And look, let me just start by saying big thanks to all the participants, all the experts behind, all the organizers, and all the speakers. And we know that what is at stake is the biggest transformation of our lives. And there are big choices ahead of us, for sure. Nevertheless, we need to recognize that somehow Europe is late in the light of the current strategic competition between the United States and China. But on the other hand, Europe can play a great role by bringing about an alternative which might inspire also new global standards. And yes, we need to have joint work, large scale, to invent a European way to shape the digital transformation and having progressives in the leading position. We need to recognize that European Union started to move with this sequence of initiatives with the purpose of regulation, the GDPR. I also voted the GDPR in the European Parliament, and now more recently, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Service Act, Data Act, Gaia X. Even today, the announcement of a European initiative for semiconductors and chips, and the regulation on platform work is being cooked. So yes, Europe is moving. Nevertheless, we need to say that this is not enough, because at the same time, yes, we need to regulate the digital transformation in order to protect citizens, consumers, workers, SMEs, but regulating is crucial, but not enough. And we need, in fact, to build new capacities. And that's why all this discussion we are having on the need of having a European industrial policy, on the need of completing and developing European infrastructures which provide a basic autonomy, on the need to take ownership of our data and to use them to build up new services and to provide better goods. And of course, on the need of developing AI according to European values. All this is urgent and crucial, and we are late. And we need to recognize that when it comes to financial means, we have a package of instruments at European level, Digital Europe, European Investment Plan, everything around European Recovery Fund. But even this is not enough. So let's use this, but also focusing particularly on the current launch of the national recovery plans, because in fact, they provide a unique opportunity to shape a European digital agenda also at national and local level. But all these can only have success if we take care of the democratic governance of this big change. And there are many missing links. It's great to have the European Parliament with much more awareness and committed MEPs such as Paul Tang. This is really making a difference. We need to make European Commission to go further in the approach. Regulation is good, but must be combined with proactive capacity building. And most of all, we need to involve citizens. And in fact, we are still not at the level we need to have, because what is at stake is to have a larger citizens movement to take back control of this digital transformation. So I believe that, yes, we need to explain to citizens that this is not only a discussion for experts. This has huge implications for their everyday life, in the way they have access to housing, to smart mobility, to green transition, and to democracy, and access to quality information when they discuss in a public debate. All this is at stake. So look, I really believe this Congress was a landing mark to organize these bigger initiatives, larger scale from the progressive side. We'll go on building on this, and we intend to develop a real political progressive strategy to gain the scale we need, meaning a European citizens movement to shape the digital revolution. So many thanks for all of you, and let's close our work for now. Thank you.